Hello everyone. Hello. My name is Georgia. I have recently graduated biology and I'm now studying an MRes in evolution at Southampton University. And this is my first time at TetZooCon and I have spent all my money. The student loans just came in and I thought, you know what? I could spend some money. I could treat myself just a little bit. But no. Little did I know I wanted something from every stall, and I'm sure you've all done the same. So I'm here today to introduce an amazing guy who sounds brilliant, and he's got the most luscious hair, as you've probably seen him around. It's a huge honour to welcome the world-famous atheist activist, public speaker, author, vlogger, podcaster, science promoter, Aaron to TetZooCon. If you've ever looked at anything online about rational thinking, atheism, countering creationism, or just the promotion of tree-based biology, chances are that you've probably come across some of his stuff. Aaron is engaged in battle it says here. He's engaged in battle with creationists on many occasions, both online and in person. In 2017, he published his first book, Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism, which he's signing and he's selling for £20 after the speculative biology talk that's going on after this. So pick up one of those, I will be, because I've got no money left. It's going to be great. He's participated in an extraordinary number of public speaking events across the US, Australia and Europe. He has also been involved in the world of politics. Ooh, very exciting stuff. He recently ran for the state senate in Texas, running as a Democratic against the other one, the Republican, Bob Hall. Although he unfortunately had to resign due to funding and other issues. Aaron currently runs the Ramen podcast, which sounds very, very great. I mean, I just love ramen as a student, obviously. In which together with Mark Nebo, he interviews guests relevant to science, religion, skepticism, politics, and related issues. So I'm definitely going to have to give that a listen when I'm done here. He is here today to talk about one of his new projects, the Phylogeny Explorer Project. Sounds very, very exciting. So without further ado, everyone please give a warm welcome to Aaron Bra.
Thank you, Georgia. That was a very enthusiastic introduction. All right, I am here to present the Phylogeny Explorer Project, which is an attempt to render the entire taxonomic tree of life as a navigable online encyclopedia of biodiversity and paleontology that I and a growing team of others have been working on for a few years now. If you've seen my series on the systematic classification of life, you've seen screenshots of our database in its early phases. We've made some improvements since then, and I'd like to share some background information as to how that came about. I'm a science communicator and an advocate of secularism and rationalism in public school classrooms, but I live in Texas, where that rarely ever happens. We're roughly half the population, and 20% of our high school science teachers are young Earth creationists who believe that our world was magically created by an incantation spell just a few thousand years ago, where all appearance of antiquity is an illusion conjured by a deliberately deceptive God, and where all fossils are the result of an epic act of thoughtless cruelty that fortunately never really happened. Still, nearly half of my countrymen believe all these things. Religious fundamentalists have achieved this high percentage of the population through a long-running grassroots propaganda program, partly to deceive the undereducated, but also to impede or distort education too. Children are trained by religious apologists to disrupt the classroom upon hearing certain key words, and teachers rarely know this subject well enough to counter that. And even if they can, they often risk a second wave attack from parents and perhaps even administrators. So most American public school teachers will not teach evolution, even if they know it well enough, which few of them do. For decades, American students have not gotten a proper science education in school. Worse, they have a deliberately distorted and cultivated misunderstanding, because most of them have been inculcated with the lies of superstitious pseudoscience, not just in church, but throughout fundamentalist religious communities, beginning as soon as children are able to learn, but before they know how to reason. So I realized that the only way your typical American would adequately understand evolution is if they were smart enough, which a lot of people aren't, and then they'd have to pay out of pocket for a grossly overpriced college education, in specific subjects relating to evolution, and then be honest and observant enough to notice and correlate key facts and concepts along the way. Very few people can or will do all of this. Religion takes advantage of that with books and videos, comics and cartoons freely available to everyone and dumbed down for even the weakest minds. That, along with cultural reinforcement of a host of logical fallacies, as well as lectures by pseudoscience con men, is how it is that half of all Americans have been duped into science-denying religious extremism. While very few people will ever have a secondary education, most folks will waste hours on end watching YouTube. So I made a series of videos for those of average intelligence, minimal understanding, and a short attention span that they could watch for free, and I would be sure that each lesson would explicitly illustrate the exact items they need to know about, as perhaps their one hope in some cases to counter religious indoctrination, at least with regard to how their spiritual leaders were lying to them about science. I made my series addressing the foundational falsehoods of creationism, like the claim that there's no beneficial mutations. And I show a list of these from peer-reviewed literature and explain how they, and the other claim that, sorry, I get the wrong ski. The other claim that there are no transitional species, and I show a list of hundreds of them and explain how they all qualify even according to the strictest definition of that word. Or the oft-repeated slogans that macroevolution is or has never been observed and that evolution is just a theory, not a fact, wherein I have to explain what those words mean and provide documentation to prove otherwise and to show that the definitions I'm using are correct where the apologists got it all wrong all along. I published that video series 10 years ago. The 10th episode of that series dealt with the creationist claim that the taxonomic tree of life was only an illusion or a fabrication, as if it's not really implied in biology or the fossil record, as if it's just godless scientists contriving connections simply by drawing lines between different kinds of animals arbitrarily. And my video showed that there is no line drawing involved, that everything fits into a hierarchical sequence of parent and daughter categories according to morphological traits and embryological development. Of course, every classification that was originally determined by these means are only estimates that can now be confirmed or occasionally corrected by a suite of different types of genetic comparisons, be it endogenous retroviruses, molecular fossils like vestiges or atavisms, or simply by mapping genetic markers across whole genome sequences. I've always said that taxonomy was the strongest evidence there ever was for evolution, and it is, even though most people don't know anything about it. In fact, it was the first evidence of evolution before anyone understood what fossils were. It is what led Darwin to predict that certain fossils would eventually be found. But before Darwin, or any notion of evolution, taxonomy first frustrated Carolus Linnaeus, because he was a pre-Darwinian creationist. But the concept of separately and magically created kinds of life could not account for the branching tree pattern revealed by the systematic classification of life. He lived at a time when species were said to be immutable. So how was it that different organisms were not individually distinctly unique, like you'd expect of anything specially created, unrelated to anything else? Instead, every organism was part of a set of similar siblings, interconnected like Russian Matryoshka dolls, where each taxonomic rank was a parent category, branching into at least two or more daughter groups in a pattern that continued in the next sequences too. That was a mystery for Linnaeus that was eventually solved by Darwin's discovery of speciation. Natural selection is only one of a few evolutionary mechanisms that we know of now, but it was the first one to show that speciation was possible, and that linked everything together. It explained everything, and it was the only explanation for this apparent family tree of life and all the synapomorphies associated with it. I mean, it can be as simple as that old Sesame Street game of one of these things is not like the other, where you see that the goat and the cow are more alike than the cat, and all of them have more in common than any of them do with the bird. But one of the many problems that common people have is, one, they have no idea of the breadth of biodiversity. Most people couldn't list even 100 species of animals, maybe a few dozen genera, and that's it. Two, most folks don't know about any more paleofauna than a few plastic pieces in a prehistoric playset. So not only do they have the impression that everything lived at the same time, their image of the tree of life looks more like a shrub, as if modern zoology was limited only to the 7 ranks that Linnaeus originally made up names for. And even if they have a good idea of extant zoology, they'd need to understand that every genus alive today represents only about 1% of what we now know is long gone, and we only know about it from the fossil record. Take the movie 1 Million Years BC, for example. And notice that most of the scenery was barren, inhospitable desert because the makers of that movie imagined that most life forms either didn't yet exist or the few that did hadn't yet spread all over the world. As if the only ancient period of the early Earth was also the prehistoric period of early man, because the producers of that film, and most of those who watched it, couldn't imagine a time before there were people. Why would anything even exist if we weren't there to experience it? The very idea that 100 million years or so ago we had just as many species as we have now, but that we didn't have any of the same ones we have now, and that 100 million years before that we again had just as many species then too, but again they were an entirely different collection than in either of the other periods, and that the same goes for the next 100 million years prior to that is somehow incomprehensible for quite a lot of common folk. If we don't understand global extinction events happening every 50 million years or so, and we don't understand the importance of biodiversity to bounce back from such events, that's a big reason why people don't understand that we are in and causing a global extinction now, and right on schedule, I might add. 3, while most people accept the fundamental mechanisms of evolution as a change in allele frequencies and reproductive populations over time, if they at least accept that dachshunds and basset hounds share a common ancestor, as do mallards and Muscovy ducks and many other examples, maybe they understand how that works through cumulative mutations and genetic drift. But there are ideologies that get in the way of their extrapolating beyond that to understand that micro and macroevolution both use all the same mechanisms and that one is just a continuation of the other. Instead, believers demand to see an example of one thing turning into another completely different kind of thing, like a pine tree giving birth to an elephant, or a chicken hatching out of a brontosaurus egg, or a fish deciding to grow legs so that it can go for a walk, or a dog giving birth to a non-dog. They don't understand that evolution is descent with inherent modification, so it's always going to be a modified version of whatever its ancestors were and never something fundamentally different like believers demand. I want to show them that evolution at every level is just a matter of incremental superficial changes in physical or chemical proportions at the population level being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarities, and that these tiers of similarities establish taxonomic clades. They need to understand that new species are derived in exactly the same way as new breeds of dogs, apart from the difference between natural and artificial selection. And just as there are natural laws specific to every other science, relativity, embryology, genetics, and so on, there are natural laws specific to evolution too, like the law of monophily, which holds that you can't outgrow your ancestry, that all your descendants will always belong to every clade your ancestors did, even if they begin new clades that don't include you. So the most important lesson I could teach in my video on the 10th foundational falsehood of creationism was that the change between kinds that creationists demand to see would actually violate evolutionary laws. And the best way to answer the question of if we came from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys, is to point out that we are still monkeys. And we never stopped being monkeys. As Tim Minchin put it, we're all just fucking monkeys in shoes. The best way I could think of to illustrate monophyletic clades in tree of life was by making an animation based on Microsoft's file tree, which back then was called Windows Explorer. If you click on any of those folders, you'd know that everything that drops out of that is included in that category. So if you click on the monkey folder, and then choose the old world over new world, and then choose apes over circopiths, and then choose great apes over lesser apes, you'll find the folder for humans. And I knew this one old earth creationist who fancied himself exceptionally scientifically literate until I explained to him face to face that if you list the diagnostic characteristics that are shared by all monkeys without making special exceptions for certain ones, you describe people. Further, if you list the diagnostic traits of old world monkeys, you describe people again. And the same thing happens when you define what an ape is, and again when you distinguish great apes of the subfamily Hominidae. Thus, we belong to all those parent or ancestral categories. And he had no way to deny that or argue against it, and he never discussed it with me again, which I consider a victory. All I did to illustrate monophyletic taxonomy was to screenshot Windows Explorer, then change all the labels in a series of illustrations compiled in a stop-motion animation, which I timed to coincide with my presentation and enhanced with additional imagery. But a lot of people didn't realize that this was just an animation. They thought that this was an actual software application, and I received more than 100 requests for access to my Phylogeny Explorer program. And that's when I realized the need for it, because at that time there were only a couple of online cladograms attempting to render everything. I especially liked Miko's Phylogeny Archive, where one guy took on the Herculean task of depicting the entire taxonomic tree of life all by himself. As you might guess by the old-style notation, this was probably the first attempt to post the whole tree of life in such detail. Not every clade is clickable, of course, but if you click on Eucynodontia, you see reptiles slowly turning into mammals. And you can keep going, or you can click back and follow other links to follow it all in either direction. You couldn't do this on paper because there'd be no way to sort it intelligibly. Miko Haramo began compiling this as soon as the internet made it possible, and it wasn't possible until then, so this is the first time anyone could look at the whole tree and navigate through it at the species level. And this is what I want. For people to be able to see all these divisions of organisms that were once at one point virtually indistinguishable from each other, to see how everything evolved. And I know people who don't know what states or countries lie over their borders in any direction, and somehow they're okay with that. I'm not. I want to know where I am geographically, chronologically, and cladistically. Now the problems with this site is that it was just one man doing it, and it wasn't peer reviewed. It didn't need to be then, it just needed to be done. But there were some mistakes. I found Oreopithecus in 2 different places, both included and excluded from the base of Hominoidea, because there was some controversy about that time, or about it at that time. And I knew things like that happened with our project too, but the reason that I know that is because we have a whole team of people working on it and checking over everything. And the goal is to have the scientific community take it over so that it would become a peer-reviewed living entity being maintained and updated by you, the academic experts, with each specialist concerned only with their area of expertise so that it's manageable. And why can't we do that with Miko's work? Because it would be too difficult to correct anything here. As you know, when all you have are fossils with no genetic confirmation, estimates based on morphology alone can be overturned or improved by more finds or better fossils. Any necessary alteration of this old school notation could lead to cascading effects requiring tedious effort. But PhylogenyExplorerProject.com isn't just a website, it's the gateway to a database that was designed such that we can instantly move any clade anywhere and all its daughters will move right along with it. And the need for that was demonstrated by the Arizona Tree of Life project, also known as TollWeb. This project was peer-reviewed, and it remains one of the best attempts at what we're trying to do too, because it at least included some encyclopedic data, which ours doesn't have yet. They also left out a few fossil forms. Propliopithecoidea, for example, was overlooked and not listed. TollWeb hired a bunch of PhDs to build a website. Thus, it was an expensive project and quickly ran out of funding. They burned through more than $1 million in a decade. It wasn't very efficient either. We built a far more robust construct than theirs in half the time and only 1/24 the cost. TollWeb is still available online and is commonly referenced today, but it was always a skeletal construct, and they stopped updating years before the completion of the Human Genome Project. Now, we have a library full of genomic sequences to compare and contrast, and they've revealed several necessary corrections just to their mammal page, which hasn't been updated in 23 years. We'd like to make those corrections, or rather, we'd like you to make those corrections. Like TollWeb, we want every clade to eventually have more info you can click on to explain what its significance is. What does it mean to be a mammal, an animal, a deuterostome, or a tetrapod? And what is the earliest known basal example of each clade? And we haven't included all those details yet, but that is the goal, and this is what it should look like. Or maybe you could adjust the background. We're still working on designs, of course. Here's last year's favorite. And this is where you would see attributions, common names, and other data. And here's what it might look like on a cell phone. And because it is a database, there are other ways this information can be shown, like connected to a timeline. We also have over a dozen languages on board for translation, and we're looking at ways of accommodating readers with disabilities, too. What we have already is the biggest continuous cladogram ever constructed. Instead of having each part stuck on a stagnant web page like TollWeb, we can select exactly which clade we want to start from. And I'll change the depth to 4 clades deep. And now we can drag over and zoom out, and go as much as 9 clades deep. Though you might have to zoom out a bit further, depending on whether you have too many taxa in one area or too many transitions in another. We have one guy who entered 1,440 dinosaur species out of more than 7,000 ancient reptiles that he put in all by himself. And we have a few dedicated people like that, including a beekeeper who signed on to enter some 20,000 species of bees. Just wait till we get a hold of a true Beatles fan. With tens of thousands of taxa entered so far, we've essentially constructed a skyscraper of a treehouse with myriad offices in it, but mostly they're all empty rooms. It's up to y'all to at least help furnish and decorate them appropriately with illustrations and explanations and whatever else, including alternative cladograms when necessary, because we want to acknowledge when there is a potential alternative. We can't leave that to Wikipedia. While I admire what they've done and what they are, my team figured out real quick that we can't trust their cladograms. Instead, we go to the citations at the bottom of the page and read those. While Wikipedia does seem to have the whole tree of life divided into single-serving slices at a time, they're often different from each other, inconsistent, contradictory, and confusing, yet linked to each other as if they all made sense together, but they don't. Our cladogram currently has several links to Wikipedia articles, but what should happen is that Wikipedia should be linking to our network. Our favorite resource is FossilWorks, an international catalog of paleontology. This was much more consistently reliable than anything else we found, though there were problems with this too. Their classifications were often too vague. Some things might be listed in the general category of Tetrapoda, for example, but we know they should be refined at least 2 or 3 degrees further. And there were also some things listed that weren't really there, like the highlighted one, for example. And like Wikipedia, FossilWorks also showed the whole tree in life in bite-sized pieces at a time, and most of the time, if you click on View Classifications, it would usually say that a full classification of the subtaxa is too large to display here. But that's what our Phylogeny Explorer project is, a full classification of the whole thing at once that you can navigate from beginning to end. Now, FossilWorks could only show a few species within a single genus, or maybe 2 in a small family, so it's very zoomed in. Another site called Evogenio is very zoomed out. It shows what they call an interactive tree of life in this one nice graphic, and it explains how to track common ancestry in terms of vast periods of geologic time, but you don't get the detail at the level of the genus or species transition to another. The Phylogeny Explorer is the only program of its kind. There we go. A cladistic visualization of biodiversity, past and present, extant or extinct, with details on all taxa based on academic rigor and available to all readers regardless of credentials. And it is expandable and flexible enough to incorporate or link to other areas or programs. And while no other project is doing exactly what we're doing, there are a couple of other sites that have popped up after I started working on ours that are similar to ours in 1 or 2 aspects. For example, the Encyclopedia of Life seems to be pretty much the same thing as the Catalog of Life and the Open Tree of Life, which all look to be academic catalogs of various species. They share our ambition for eventually listing every named species, but they're only concerned with those that are still alive. And of all of them, only the Open Tree of Life makes any attempt to show the relatedness, though even that is minimal compared to the tree that we're building. Easily the prettiest site that is in any way similar to ours is OneZoom. They push the tree analogy into a nice animation that appeals particularly to the lady, but it doesn't have any practical application for scientists. You can scroll through the tree and it's labeled in layman's terms, so it's hard even for children to get lost. It's a fine illustration, especially for the average person, but again, it just lists recent species, so you can't see how they evolved, and it doesn't explain that either. It just shows you where modern organisms are, but doesn't tell you how or why they're there. Then there's Time Tree, which focuses on evolutionary stages over the time scale of life, even accounting for climactic changes in past periods. I put the word Varanus, which is a genus name for monitor lizards, and this is what I got, which is brilliant for the little bit that you can see at one time. And bear in mind that, like all the other sites I just mentioned, all the listed species here are extant. There are no fossil forms like mosasaurs or megalania. I entered Euparkeria, Velociraptor, Dimetrodon, and even Homo, and it didn't know any of these names, but it knows common names like human, and it gives this linear phylogeny reminiscent of Linnaean ranks. So it too apparently only logs recent species. They've got 97,000 of them, which is impressive, but they only have the living ones, nothing from the fossil record. Otherwise, I like this site. I think it's very useful despite this limitation. It also has a feature that our Phylogeny Explorer engineers have been trying to figure out how to get it integrated into our system for more than a year now, where you can put in 2 different species and it'll show you how distantly related they are. We want to be able to trace backward from any genus or species all the way till it shares a parent clade with another species and then trace forward to it from there, maybe by bolding one of the lines or leaving something equivalent to a trail of breadcrumbs. And we're still working on the breadcrumbs feature to at least assist those who don't understand the Latin words. TimeTree does this a little differently. I put in crocodile and duck and discovered that the crocoduck lived more than 245 million years ago. But again, it provides no explanation of what that basal transition really was. And despite that, TimeTree is, I think, the best of the databases that does anything that we're doing, and they're not doing everything that we're doing. I think that that project and ours could even be loosely associated and not step on each other's toes. The next and final website I need to mention is one of the pioneer sites from the 1990s. Paleos.com offers cladograms and paleofauna with the primary goal being the explanation of evolution over geologic periods. But they also had more and better information about paleofauna than any other source available online, and a lot of the species that they described in depth with graphic depictions and illustrations were sometimes things you couldn't find online anywhere else. Paleos was a voluminous site once upon a time, but there were a few years when much of it was taken offline, I think due to a lack of funding. Lamentations from the scientific community is what brought it back. Paleos was a labor of love created by a handful of dedicated autodidacts rather than traditional academics, but professional paleontologists frequently referenced that site because of the quality of detailed information provided therein, explaining every stage of evolution in every lineage we've ever found fossils for. That's what I want too. Not just listing each individual species, but also explaining the significance of the named clades and the autapomorphies associated with each one. So I'm proud to say that in the last year or so, the entire creative team behind Paleos has signed on to merge with the Phylogeny Explorer Project. And one of them, Renato Santos, is here today having flown in from Portugal. Welcome, sir. And if I'm not bragging already, one of the other speakers at this conference, Albert Chen, is also one of our researchers, and we're happy for that association. Our team are all volunteers. We need to be as cost efficient as possible so no one's drawing a salary from this, apart from a couple engineers who built the database and were cut loose after. We actually did that twice. At first we had something that looked nice enough and thought that'll do, but once we plugged in a few thousand taxa, it collapsed and had to be redesigned from scratch to ensure that it could bear the massive volume of data being put into it. That was a substantial initial investment provided by an altruistic benefactor who is here with us today, and I'd like to take this opportunity to formally and publicly thank Mr. Charles Buchan for his altruism in funding and founding this project. We could not make this contribution to science without your philanthropy, sir. Also with us today is our project manager, Steve Owen, and Mr. Owen has assembled an entirely voluntary international workforce of dozens of active team leaders and a couple hundred more contributors and others on standby, all with varied skills from biology, IT, graphics design, marketing, and so on. Many have been with the project for more than a year, and we have new blood arriving daily. Thanks to Mr. Owen, we are fully structured and run on a detailed project management program going from strength to strength. And at this time, I'd like to give a special shout out to our leadership team, Casey, Tiffany, Veronica, and Emily. Each of our people is monitored and trained to ensure that they're familiar with what to do. We have an exhaustive guide to data entry, and the system logs all the work being done, and it's backed up with safety devices for data security, and we're all super motivated and excited to be part of this project. Our budget from here on is based on donations from a range of sources, including internally. We may occasionally need a skeletal crew of technical people, but not much more than that, plus ongoing software needs, hosting costs, occasional purchases like materials and other sundries. And for that reason, we have a team of fundraisers currently collating information on a range of different source types to apply when ready. We could run indefinitely, perhaps forever, on just one of the 2 grants that were given to TollWeb. We may consider that option too. My wife has on a Master of Science writing program from Johns Hopkins and already has a technical and professional writing certificate, so she may write our grant proposal. But what this project really needs, more than anything else, is for paleontologists and zoologists, entomologists, botanists, microbiologists, and paleo artists to take part in their areas of interest and expertise, to be sure that the information is there that should be. And we are offering attendees these business cards allowing exclusive private access to the Explorer. You should find one in every one of your seats. You're probably sitting on one. And you are the only people outside of a few volunteers already working on the project and some invited experts who will be allowed access, and you may edit. We have people on hand to help or advise via the Facebook group, and we can point you to other documentation on how to use the program. Because if we can make the biggest cladogram ever constructed into an encyclopedic multifunction database and a useful research tool for scientists, then it'll have practical and educational value for students and teachers too, and that would be a worthy contribution to science. Thank you. I wrote a 5,000-word speech and was told I had 30 minutes to deliver it, so I hope I didn't go too fast.